네, 안녕하십니까. 대한민국시도지사협의회 영국사무소장 조상범입니다. 저는 영국 대사관에 근무를 하고 있습니다. 오늘 글로벌 정책 리서치 웨비나에 참석해 주신 우리나라와 영국의 지자체 공무원 여러분께 감사드립니다. 특히 오늘 많은 분들이 참가해 주셔서 오늘 좋은 자리가 될 것 같습니다. 글로벌 정책 리서치는 시도지사협의회 매년 역점 사업인데요. 매년 시사성 있는 외국의 해외 정책 사례를 국내 지자체에 소개하는 프로그램입니다. 우리나라와 영국은 많이 다르죠. 많이 다른데 또 공통점이 없지 않다고 할 수 있습니다. 영국의 최근 지방행정 분야가 지방자치, 즉 이제 직선시장을 선출하면서 이제 지방자치가 강화되고 있고 지역 균형 발전 전략이라고 하는 레벨링업 전략이 추진되고 있습니다. 이는 현장 중심, 즉 지자체라는 이런 현장 중심의 플레이스 베이스를 기반으로 한 정책이 그 밑바탕이 된다고 할 수 있습니다. 우리나라도 지방자치단체들이 겪고 있는 그 인구 감소 위기라든지 주택 문제와 같은 도시정책 문제가 화두입니다. 이런 차원에서 오늘 주제는 런던시의 도시재생과 주택 공급 전략, 특히 이제 서민들의 저렴한 주택 공급 전략인 런던시의 어포더블 하우징 사례를 소개하도록 하겠습니다. 런던시는 도시계획이라고 하는 이제 런던 플랜을 가지고 있습니다. 런던 플랜을 통해서 공간 개발 전략을 마련하고 있고요. 특히 이제 교통시설과 인프라를 잘 갖춘 38개 지역을 아파트너티 에어리어로 지정해서 이 기회 지역, 즉 아파트너티 에어리어를 중심으로 해서 10년 단위의 주기적인 대규모 주택 공급 전략을 추진하고 있습니다. 그리고 런던시에서는 런던 플랜을 통해서 각 기초자치단체라고 할 수 있는 33개의 기초자치단체에 대한 도시재생 사업 전략과 가이드라인을 설정하고 있습니다. 이와 관련해서 오늘 모신 연사분들을 간략히 소개해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 제1주제인 런던시 도시재생 전략과 관련해서 로레타 리스 교수님을 소개합니다. 교수님께서는 영국 레스터 대학에 재직 중이신데요. 금년 7월 1일경에 이제 미국 보스턴 대학으로 또 옮기실 예정입니다. 바쁘신 와중에 시간을 내셔서 좋은 강의를 해주시는 데 대해서 진심으로 감사드립니다. 교수님께서는 특히 이제 런던시 도시재생의 전문가이시기도 하시지만 현 런던시장 주택위원회 의장을 직전에 역임하셨습니다. 두 번째 시간은 런던시청 데보라 헐링 선임 주택정책관입니다. 런던시는 장기주택 전략 공급 계획을 마련하고 매년 일정 규모 주택을 공급하면서 이 중에서 이제 서민형 저렴한 주택을 공급하는 전략인 어포더블 하우징 주택 공급 전략을 추진하고 있습니다. 오늘 런던시 사례와 관련해서 생생한 사례를 중심으로 여러분들이 좋은 시간이 될 것 같습니다. 마지막 시간에는 신현방 런던정경대 LSE 교수님께서 종합 정리 겸 마무리 말씀을 해주실 예정입니다. 교수님께서는 이번 웨비나를 기획하는 데 많은 도움을 특히 주셨습니다. 감사합니다. 앞으로도 대한민국 시도지사협의회 영국사무소에서는 한영 교류에 더욱 노력해 나가도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 웨비나 시간이 우리 지자체 공무원 여러분들께 소중한 시간이 되기를 바랍니다. 알차고 유익한 시간 되십시오. 모든 참석자분들 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 그럼 첫 번째 발표자로 참석하신 로레타 리즈 교수님께 주제 발표를 부탁드리겠습니다. 리즈 교수님.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to talk this morning, my time, I guess in the afternoon, your time, on urban regeneration in London. So I'm going to just go through an outline of my talk. So I'm going to talk about what is urban regeneration in the British context. I'm going to talk about urban governance and planning in London, and I'm going to give a very short history and an overview. I'm going to talk about the role of the Mayor of London, which is quite particular. I'm going to talk about urban regeneration as a response to urban decline. And then I'm going to focus on two specific case studies, one King's Cross, which I understand you've visited before, and one the Haygate Estate in London. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts for mayors in South Korea from London. So first of all, just to give you a sense of who am I? None of you probably met me before, and what my expertise is. So I'm an urban geographer, so a social scientist with international expertise in urban regeneration. I've worked at the University of Leicester as a professor of human geography for about 8 years now. Before that, I was at King's College London in geography for about 16 years. And I'm actually in the process of moving to the United States to take up a new position as director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University. And importantly, in this new job, I'm going to be working with the new mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu. I've also just stood down because of moving to Boston as the chair of the London Housing Panel. And over the last 2 years, I've been working with Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, on housing policy and practice in the British capital. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. But I thought it was really important to contextualise what urban regeneration means in the UK. And obviously it's different in different countries, and less so in different cities, but certainly in different countries in terms of kind of cultural expectations that policy has of urban regeneration. So in the British context, urban regeneration refers to government attempts to reinvigorate rundown urban areas, especially in the inner city. It was intended, of course, to deal with the negative consequences of urban decline, while interventions to improve the living conditions in cities can be traced back to the Victorian era. What might now be recognised as urban regeneration emerged in the 1960s. The term urban regeneration is not a singular term, it's actually an umbrella term, so a term that kind of covers lots of other ways of labelling urban regeneration. So it covers terms like urban renewal, urban redevelopment or development, and more recently, urban renaissance and urban sustainability. So we could say that the most recent history of urban regeneration in the UK began with post-Second World War urban renewal programmes, the inner city clearances or slum clearances after the war, enacted in the 1950s, the 1960s, and into the 1970s. But of course, even back then, there was a backlash against the destruction of long-standing working class or low-income communities in the inner city caused by these slum clearances. And by the 1970s, the emphasis of government policy in terms of urban regeneration had shifted. It shifted to refurbishment instead of demolition, and particularly local authorities were giving what they called improvement grants, particularly home improvement grants, as a way of upgrading existing properties. And in many cases, this kind of strategy led to the revival in fortunes of many of these decaying city areas, but without demolishing. By the 1980s, urban regeneration was a mix of urban revitalisation, urban development, and urban redevelopment. The Thatcher government set up enterprise zones and urban development corporations. You'll be familiar with London Docklands as one of these, to deal with problems in British inner cities. In the late 1990s through the 2000s, it was then done under the label of urban renaissance, then urban sustainability, and the most recent label or moniker is levelling up. So, urban regeneration programmes, British urban regeneration, what does it do or what does it seek to do? So, urban regeneration programmes interpret urban problems and their causes, and these shape the programmes themselves. So it's important to situate urban regeneration programmes in their historical, geographical and political contexts. The nature of urban regeneration in the UK and indeed in London has changed markedly through time. So in the UK, urban regeneration seeks to support vulnerable communities and localities through the redistribution of resources on the basis of need, or to promote growth and development and improve the lot of those most in need. So you'll see quite clearly here an emphasis on helping people who are already in place and particularly marginal populations who are in need, so the poor or low-income communities. So the aims of urban regeneration are to improve the built environment, but also environmental sustainability, to improve the quality of life for certain populations, and this can be a mixture of, for example, physical improvements to their living conditions, so improving their homes, or improving local cultural activities or facilities. It also aims to improve the social welfare of particular populations, so there's an interest in social mobility, economic mobility of the poor, bringing people up in social terms. And one of the aims is to enhance the economic perspectives of certain populations. This is the economic mobility through job creation, education or better education, or reskilling if there's a feeling they don't have the skills needed. So there are many different kinds of urban regeneration, and they all have different aims and different effects. But I think one thing that's really important is that urban regeneration is a discourse. Now, what do I mean by that? So when I talk about urban regeneration as a discourse, it is a way of describing or constructing development activities. So its concern is to mobilize them. So the term urban regeneration as a discourse and the kind of text that goes with it, the policy that goes with it, is there to mobilize support from local populations, from the public, etc. It is not an attempt to provide a precise understanding. And social scientists like myself and others who want to understand it tend to need to go behind the label of urban regeneration to understand what it conceals, and it does hide things. So meaning floats behind the discourse or the term. So if we think about what regeneration signifies in the British context, it signifies things like revitalisation, rebirth, restart, regrowth. You see, it's very much kind of forward thinking and it's renewing things. It also has particular connotations. So it has this kind of, the place you're going to regenerate is kind of dead, it's in decline. We need to bring it back to life. That it's ill, it's unhealthy. We somehow need to restore the health of this place. And that it's been in decline, and that we need economic growth. We might need population growth, depending on the context. The idea of urban regeneration in that case is to end that decline and to bring growth. But of course, the questions we might want to ask is the life of what? The health of what? The growth of what? So often the specifics are quite hidden in these urban regeneration discourses. But of course, the key question is it a good thing? Is urban regeneration a good thing? And for who? Specifically for who? Now, urban regeneration has many meanings. As a concept, it has many meanings. It has a strong symbolic element. It draws on ideas about renewal and particularly, increasingly, urban competition. It defines itself as something that's obviously good. So urban regeneration is always put forward as a good thing, and therefore it discourages critique or critical analysis. It's a symbol in shaping elite and public perceptions of change. But urban regeneration is also part of what might be known as a justificatory discourse. And that is for an existing population, but it also could be for a new population. And frequently there's displacement of existing populations by new ones, and I'll talk about that in my case studies later. Urban regeneration is often a euphemism for gentrification, so it often hides gentrification. Although the label is urban regeneration, it can cause gentrification. In other words, the displacement of low-income groups. It is a justification for replacing old land uses, and in the British context, often kind of ex-industrial, with new ones, usually kind of service economy. It can be a justification for population growth, and that population growth is usually a new population. It's about businesses, and it's about attracting more businesses and certainly different kinds of businesses. And it's, obviously kind of 21st century economy businesses like science parks, the attraction of tourists, commerce, that kind of stuff. It's about jobs, it's about attracting more jobs, but importantly, it's also about attracting different kinds of jobs. But again, the question should be, who are those jobs for? Are they for the local residents, or are they an attempt to attract new people in? Are they for commuters who are commuting in from outside of inner London, from the suburbs in London or even beyond, to work, and then they go home and don't actually live in the local area? And of course, finally, urban regeneration is part of a justificatory discourse for new shopping facilities, for sports arenas, for cultural facilities, and it all becomes kind of embedded with that. So, before moving on to the case studies, I just want to set the context, which is really important, and just talk a little bit first about urban governance and planning in London. So London's role as the capital city of the UK, and of course as the location of our central government, global business interests and financial markets, significant arts and cultural facilities. It's also a place of tourism. It's a renowned worldwide centre of education, with numerous universities and other educational institutes. And all of this has justified successive national governments' desire to promote London and its wider region economically. So the United Kingdom is very much dominated by London as an economic vehicle. And there's been lots of pressure to protect the city as a world urban power. And I think that context is really, really important. A range of interventions by government have demonstrated a commitment to promote and strengthen London further over time in the face of global competition, and to be clear that it's the UK's premier city and a premier global city. This is evidenced by decisions to support massive regeneration schemes in and around the capital, such as Thames Gateway, to invest in infrastructure and transportation developments like the Channel Tunnel rail link, the extension of Heathrow Airport, and Crossrail. And it also led, of course, to the 2012 Olympic bid, which many see as a successful example of urban regeneration. But it's also been about supporting the city as a financial hub and a focal point for global business, and about promoting this to the outside world. So that's the kind of background context to why London is so important in terms of urban regeneration programmes in the UK. Now, in terms of governance, the Mayor of London. Over the last 60 years, successive governments and politicians have attempted to grapple with the governance, institutional structures and planning of London. Since 2000, London has been governed by an elected mayor. So the elected mayor is still quite a new thing in London. It's only been going for 22 years now. And this has been within a broader governmental framework provided by central government, regional governing structures, local municipalities, in other words, local borough councils, and an elected London-wide assembly. And on top of that, there's also a range of quasi-autonomous central government bodies and other ad hoc partnerships. So a very complicated governance model. Indeed, there's been very little consensus on the right relationship and degree of responsibility between these different bodies, even though the mayor was awarded further additional powers in 2007, particularly in relation to strategic matters for the city. Rather, the growth of mayoral powers raised wider issues concerning democratic accountability across the region and served to highlight the ongoing and perhaps historic tensions that exist between the agencies of change on the one hand on different forms of democracy and claims to democracy that are present in London on the other. So the Mayor of London, and this is important, possesses some of the powers necessary to set a clear vision for the city, but as a result of this fragmentation of power between central and local interests, he or she often lacks many of the implementation roles that are necessary to turn that vision into a practical reality. So in fact, the Mayor of London has limited powers in comparison to mayors elsewhere in the world. So now a very quick lesson on the evolution of governance and planning in London, which sets the context for urban regeneration in the city in a slightly different way. So this is a focus on planning over time. So if we go back to the period of 1888 to 1901, this saw the creation of the London County Council and then 28 metropolitan boroughs. Now, this is a system of government that existed for much of the 1900s, but attempts to develop a comprehensive plan for the wider metropolitan area of London as the city sprawled failed to take hold, despite recognition of the need for some means of strategic growth management. So there was very little control over London in this early period of governance, and London sprawled. From just before the Second World War, and certainly after it, strategic and regional planning was on the national political agenda. This saw the development of the 1944, still very important, Greater London Plan by Sir Patrick Abercrombie, also known as the Abercrombie Plan. And this began to plan the decentralisation of London and London's populations and some of its industries into satellite towns some distance from London. And of course, this is also the time when London's Green Belt was formulated, and that Green Belt, which still exists, restricts the further sprawling of London from the existing built-up area. Now, Abercrombie's plan was criticised for being too top-down, and that demographic change and growing economic prosperity in London had actually generated a much faster rate of population growth and decentralisation than he'd even predicted. And in fact, as the centre of London began to decentralise, it began to hollow out, and this then became seen to be a problem. And this hollowing out of central London as a result of some of this decentralisation began to be seen as one of the problems that was leading to further urban decline in London. In 1965, the London County Council was replaced by the Greater London Council, better known as the GLC, which now had 32 London boroughs. This, of course, was politically motivated by the Conservative Party, who were concerned by the exodus of wealthy or affluent voters out of the original London County Council area. So as the wealthy began to leave London, it was left with a kind of hollowed out, poorer centre. And of course, this was an issue for Conservatives who traditionally had relied on the votes of wealthier people. The 1970 Labour government tried to manage the scale and location of growth through a strategic plan for the southeast. So rather than just focusing on London, they began to develop a plan for the wider southeast. But the plan's deterministic approach was ineffective in persuading key agencies, particularly elected government, to support its implementation. Then, and this is the most important, the Thatcher government scrapped the Greater London Council and the 6 other metropolitan counties in England in 1986, and in so doing, reduced the role and status of local authority planning and effectively stripped away regulatory planning from urban regeneration. And this is really important because even the control of local councils over planning got pulled back. This was now increasingly performed by non-democratically elected urban development corporations and increasingly through private sector-led, property-led regeneration. So, for example, the London Docklands Corporation is an example of where Thatcher imposed market-led solutions on urban problems. Then, as a new Labour government came to power in 1997, it pledged to reinstate not only directly elected strategic government for London, but also a new directly elected mayor. So from 2000, the British government transferred the responsibility of strategic planning in such important areas as transport, economic development and planning to a new elected position, and that was the Mayor of London. The Mayor was now to lead a new Greater London Authority, or GLA. At face value, it looked like some kind of successor to the Greater London Council or the GLC, but actually it was fundamentally different. While a newly directly elected London Assembly was designed to keep check on the Mayor's activities and ensure accountability. So importantly, the office of Mayor of London has been described as one of the least powerful world mayors. The main role of the Mayor of London is to set a framework of strategies in order to promote sustainable development, health, and equality within London. And the most significant of these are the London Plan, which provides the spatial development framework for planning and growth in London, the Transport Strategy, which offers policies and proposals designed to significantly improve transport in London. For example, the Mayor of London has overriding control of Transport for London, which runs the tubes, the buses, etc. Also, Economic Development Strategy, a programme of action to address London's economic weaknesses, to build on its strengths, but also to capitalise on key opportunities. Now, out of this, the London Plan is the most important document in terms of strategy. But the Mayor has been in a very difficult situation with regard to implementing this plan, mainly because planning also sits as a statutory activity with local London boroughs. In reality, what actually happens in London, and this answers one of the questions put to me, is a form of integrated strategic planning with public, private and voluntary actors all entering into partnerships to realise development. And in fact, the Mayor of London has to enact and be part of these partnerships to get anything done in terms of urban regeneration. So, urban regeneration in London. As I said earlier, it was a response, it developed in a response to urban decline. And the London back in the 1970s was not like the London we see today. In the 1970s, London, like other major cities around the world, was hemorrhaging jobs, it was hemorrhaging people. Approximately 750,000 people left London in the 1970s. It was no longer seen as a place to live or get a job, even in some cases. Indeed, many inner London boroughs lost up to a fifth of their population between 1971 and 1981, and particularly the white working classes left, many of them for jobs and other opportunities and better housing outside of London, many of them to the decentralised satellite towns that Abercrombie had designed. They left manufacturing or transport-based industries in inner London for the new service sector, which was primarily located outside of London. So there was a dramatic transformation in the London economy as jobs disappeared, and many of the working classes that worked in them left if they could, or if they did remain, they remained in a form of economic inactivity and often in marginalised, private rented or social housing. Between the slum clearances of the early 20th century and debates about the post-Olympic city, which are debates that are ongoing at the moment in London, the drive to regenerate London has intensified. So the pressure, the drive to regenerate has really, I think, escalated in many ways. We can see cranes today all over central London, and in fact, even over suburban London. Yet today, with a focus on increasing land values, regeneration schemes that purport to foster diverse and creative new neighbourhoods typically displace precisely the qualities, activities and communities that they claim to support. So this is why I started by talking about the discourse of urban regeneration. which has a very positive spin, the reality is very, very different. All too often, regeneration is a form of neoliberal urbanisation concealed behind a facade or a discourse of social and economic improvement. Urban decline and regeneration appear to be ubiquitous and influential, but nonetheless seriously misleading, I would argue, ways of understanding suffering and prosperity in the city. So what I want to do now is turn to two different case studies of contemporary urban regeneration in London. The case of King's Cross on derelict and underused land, which I heard you visited, and also the case of the Haygate Estate in Southwark, which saw the demolition of a large residential public housing estate. So the King's Cross example of urban regeneration is about a kind of mixed use regeneration scheme, and the Haygate Estate, which I'll talk about, is more of a residential regeneration scheme. And I think it's interesting to look at two different types. So King's Cross, hopefully these pictures will strike some memories for you guys. The redevelopment of a significant proportion of land immediately north of London's King's Cross train station is often touted as an exemplar of the best of urban policy and practice, both in London, nationally, but actually also internationally. The redevelopment was based on sustainable development principles, including the recycling of waste materials generated by construction activity, the design of eco-friendly buildings, and supposedly the incorporation of local community views into development proposals, policies and processes. And you can see from the map here that the King's Cross London regeneration area is next to King's Cross Station, and it's also bordered by the London Borough of Camden and also the London Borough of Islington, but it's dominated actually by the London Borough of Camden. Now in the 1970s, going back to my kind of thesis on this urban decline to urban regeneration, in the 1970s, King's Cross was the largest plot of derelict and underused land in central London. Much of the railway infrastructure around the two stations was either underutilised or abandoned. The site comprised a mixture of semi-derelict and derelict Victorian infrastructure, including railway sidings, loading depots, warehouses, and a number of listed buildings. However, and I think it's really important to say this, although it looked like an area of decay and decline, it was an area that was not without economic activity or even vitality. And a number of small businesses operated in the area, taking advantage of the central locations and in particular of the low rents. Now, the development potential of King's Cross came to the fore in 1987 after it was identified as the terminus for the Eurostar high-speed train link to Europe. But through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, various planning applications for comprehensive redevelopment were rejected by Camden Council or never came to fruition. This was due to a mixture of local community opposition, Camden Council's dissatisfaction with the lack of community consultation for these plans, but also a downturn in the property market in the early 1990s that made the construction of new office space an unviable proposition. So in 2000, so in other words, the kind of plans for regenerating King's Cross had been kind of percolating around for quite some time. But in 2000, with government trying to secure deals for a Channel Tunnel rail link, Argent were appointed as the project partners, and they proceeded to outline a mixed-use development proposal. King's Cross was designated by the Greater London Assembly as one of 28 opportunity areas in London. So what is an opportunity area? Opportunity areas, or OAs, are identified in the Mayor's London Plan as key locations with potential for new homes, jobs and infrastructure of any type. Many are linked to existing or potential public transport improvements, and they typically have quite large capacity for redevelopment. For example, at least 2,500 new homes or 5,000 new jobs, or a combination of both. Infrastructure and collaborative planning are key to the delivery of London's opportunity areas. In many cases, opportunity areas require major investment in transport and proper planning of utilities, social infrastructure, and digital connectivity to support the day-to-day lives of Londoners. Its management says that King's Cross has outperformed all other London opportunity areas, with jobs increasing by 500% over the past decade, the local population growing by 141%, and the 67-acre site having capacity for 18,000 jobs and supporting an annual gross value added of £1.42 billion. So it is now argued to be one of the most successful of London's opportunity areas. The area currently has 1,120 homes, and there's another 300 that are still under construction. So the regeneration of King's Cross has been touted as a great success. In 2008, Argent, London and Continental Railways and DHL formed a joint partnership, King's Cross Central Limited Partnership, bit of a mouthful. The partnership was the single landowner at King's Cross. Much of the early investment was focused in and around the Victorian buildings that once formed the goods yard of the railway. In 2011, the University of the Arts London moved to the Granary complex, and parts of the development opened to the public for the first time. Since then, restaurants have opened, the Great Northern Hotel has been refurbished, and new residents have moved in. The historic coal drops yard, where the coal would be dropped for the railways, has been redeveloped as a unique shopping destination, and companies such as Google, Facebook, Universal Music and Havas have chosen to locate here. New public streets, squares and gardens have opened. For example, Granary Square, which has become quite well known now, the Lewis Cubic Park and Square, and more recently Gasholder Park. In January 2015, so 7 years ago, the UK government and DHL announced the sale of their investment in the King's Cross redevelopment to Australian Super, which is Australia's biggest superannuation pension fund, run only to profit members. And what this does in my mind is demonstrates this connection between urban regeneration and financialisation, which is increasingly the case in urban regeneration in London. So despite its touted success, the regeneration has been heavily criticised. The planning application for the site was given approval in 2006. It spans 2 boroughs, Camden and Islington, as I've said. But there was activist groups who believe quite vocally in many cases that the London Borough Council was also part of the problem in this scheme, in that it was pushing international investment at the expense of the local community. They said that a development that has international stature contributes to London as a world city. So even the London Borough Council had attached to this world city discourse of London. So they set up the King's Cross Development Forum, which was an umbrella organisation that sought to represent the community in terms of community views about the future of King's Cross. Now, Argent, the developer, declared commitment to inclusive mixed-use sustainable development. They even developed a brief called Principles for a Human City, which set out their sustainable development credentials around the economy, equality and the environment. So Argent liked to put itself forward as part of a new progressive movement in the development and construction industry in which commercial objectives were aligned with ethical kind of outcomes. But since the late 1990s, urban renaissance policy in the UK has encouraged the development of inclusive urban regeneration, in which local community viewpoints are expected to be part of the consultation process. The Urban White Paper said urban regeneration must be inclusive and communities must be fully engaged in the process from the start. Everyone must be included. The London Mayor in the London Plan has said that any regeneration needs to secure benefits for the local communities adjacent to developments. And particularly, the Mayor of London has pushed for social and economic impact assessments of regeneration schemes to ensure that local communities gain from these developments. As a result of this, Argent itself was forced to engage with the community, but they did this in a very particular way. They hired a team of private consultants. These were deployed to convey the very positive messages around urban regeneration, but there were real tensions and contradictions. As one resident said, community empowerment means exactly the opposite. All these words have been taken and used and now being used against us all. It's not about empowerment, it's about consultants getting jobs and privatising things. So people in and around King's Cross, local communities had issues with it. And this is an interview from one local who reacted, "Some of us who have lived or worked around King's Cross for decades take a different view. The development led to some poorer residents losing their homes. Some small local businesses which served the community were forced out to make way for others that are of little use to many locals, even if they could afford to use them. In addition, there's been a loss of a large area of publicly owned land, which could and should have housed much needed public infrastructure, but was given over to shops for the environment destroying elite and offices owned by billionaires. If this was all a triumph, it was a triumph for the supporters of a society that makes the poor poorer and the rich richer, and one that has lost any sense of what it means to be part of a community." So the positives, of course, are about replacing a decayed urban environment with a new one, triggering local economic growth. It now has a new neighbourhood brand. It's called N1C. There is, I will admit, some great landscape architecture, and it could at one level be seen as a successful new mixed economy. But the negatives, it's pushed out long-standing local communities and local businesses, and the area has been remade into a new upper middle class space that's too expensive for local residents. So now to my second case, the regeneration of the Haygate Estate in Southwark. Now, the Haygate Estate is a large council, or was a large council estate that was completed in 1974 that housed council tenants. It was a popular place to live. People thought that their apartments were light, spacious, well built. There was lots of green space, as you can see in the images in the middle here. But in 1999, Southwark Council's Director of Regeneration, Fred Manson, sparked controversy when he claimed that social housing generates people on low incomes coming in, and that generates poor school performances. Middle class people stay away. So mixed communities policy was used by Fred Manson, who was the head of regeneration at Southwark Council, as a justification for demolishing this large council estate and building a new mixed income, or supposedly mixed income, community on the footprint. They planned 2,704 new homes, of which only 82 would be socially rented. So here we can see quite clearly the image of a dense, but actually successful and well constructed and well built council estate. Social sustainability is a dominant element in discourses on urban regeneration in London, and regeneration programmes across London have sought funding on the basis of mixed and sustainable communities. The first London plan, developed by London's first mayor, Ken Livingstone, wanted to underline the city's economic growth and global city prosperity, but at the same time to increase social inclusion and improve London's environmental sustainability. social sustainability was envisioned by Ken Livingstone. Social inclusivity, to give all Londoners the opportunity to share in London's future success, he said. So the London Plan ambitiously set out to do what few cities had done before, which was not only to be economically sustainable, but also socially, in terms of social equity. The policy of mixed communities emerged in the late 1990s through national government. The idea was to deconcentrate large-scale homogenous areas of social deprivation in the inner city and to socially mix those communities to improve social inclusion of the poor. There was a feeling that poor people living next to wealthier people would improve their social and economic mobility. But as much as the academic evidence shows, this led to the demolition of social housing and the large-scale displacement of council tenants. So Southwark sold the 9-hectare Haygate Estate to developers Lend-Lease at a huge loss for just £50 million, having spent £44 million emptying the site and £21.5 million planning its redevelopment. Originally, the residents were promised new homes as part of the regeneration, but these had not been built by the time they were decanted. And in February 2013, in a public inquiry into the compulsory purchase order on leasehold homes, it was confirmed then that this estate actually could have been very easily refurbished. It didn't need to be demolished, it was structurally sound. But the last remaining leaseholder was pushed out in 2013. And in December 2013, the Design Council and lots of others actually had published a series of articles praising this estate and a real sadness that this estate was to be demolished. So to give you a sense of the displacements that happened, there's two maps here which came out of some research that I did. The first is of council tenants, and you can see that they've been displaced off the estate in and around South London, so completely away from the area that they'd lived in for 20, 30 years. The second figure shows leaseholders, so those people who actually owned their apartments on the Haygate Estate through right to buy legislation, and they were pushed out even further because the money that they were given from Southwark Council in order to buy another property elsewhere was simply not enough in London in terms of inflated property values. So the Haygate Estate here became very much a symbolic lesson of how not to do urban regeneration, as large-scale displacements were announced and in fact came to fruition. So what are some of the impacts of these displacements? They weren't social sustainability. There was destruction of social networks and family support networks. Leaseholders lost their investments, their savings. People lost their jobs because it was too far to commute when they were displaced. Community support networks were broken. There were mental and physical health issues, depression, suicides. Children had to move school or travel a very long way to the same school. So there were charges here, as the image at the bottom says, of social cleansing. So the Haygate Estate was replaced by Elephant Park, and this was sold off-plan in East Asia before it was even built. And many of the apartments that have now been bought up are actually investment apartments. They're empty, and this has led to kind of charges of empty homes and of this now being a new ghost community. So of course, this is the polar opposite of what social sustainability is supposed to be. So what are the lessons from the Haygate Estate? Well, before there were structurally sound buildings, it was a mixed community. The residents loved living there. It had mature London pine trees. It had birds and wildlife. After a new build development, it's now an overseas investor ghost community with empty properties. There are planted new green spaces, but they pulled up lots of the mature vegetation, and often these spaces are gated. So in a nutshell, this has become a symbol in London and an international symbol actually also of how not to do urban regeneration. So in order to finish, just some thoughts for mayors in career from London. So I'd like to re-emphasise what UN Habitat has said. Urban regeneration brings back underutilised assets and redistributes opportunities, increasing urban prosperity and quality of life. urban regeneration initiatives are complex, lengthy, and run the risk of gentrifying private space or privatising public space. At UN Habitat, we work for urban regeneration that ensures affordability, access to services, and involvement of local residents to promote local economic development, where public space is key, and cities reduce environmental impact and greenhouse gas emissions. The preservation and valorisation of historic and cultural heritage is a key opportunity for urban regeneration as well. And remember that the Haygate Estate could have been refurbished. So one of the suggestions I have off the back of this talk, which hopefully you found interesting, is actually to survey South Korean mayors to examine some of the leadership and management challenges facing Korean cities today with regards to urban regeneration, and in particular to survey their ideas on inclusive and ethical urban regeneration, inclusive and ethical urban regeneration. And just to give you an example, you could follow, for example, the Marino Mayoral Survey model, which has been led by Boston University's Initiative on Cities, which I'm moving to in a couple of months. And they've done some really interesting work in terms of thinking through what mayors want, what mayors are able to do, and how they can be helped. So thank you very much.
Well, it's very good to be with you. My name is Deborah Halling. I'm a Senior Policy Officer in the Housing Policy team at the Greater London Authority, so working for the Mayor of London. It's a little bit daunting to be the only person on your programme who's not a professor, but hopefully there will be some useful insights for you in your context and career. And I hope that perhaps someone from your organisation will be able to come and share some insights from career with me and my colleagues in London at some point. So I will focus today on housing related content because that's the area where I work and the area where I know most, but I've included a few slides that cover wider areas that I know you asked about in your really impressive and interesting sets of questions. Right, let me just see if I can move on to my next slide. So just to give you a bit of a sense of where we'll go today, I will give a bit of an overview of the governance structure in London, and appreciate there may be some overlap there with some of the material that Professor Lee has covered. But I hope some of what I say will just mean that some of the subsequent content makes a bit more sense than it otherwise would. I will spend a bit of time then just talking a bit about housing in London and some of the challenges that Londoners and the Mayor face. And then I will spend most of our time today focusing on the Mayor's approach to tackling those issues, and I will talk about the London Plan, the Mayor's programme of investment in affordable housing, and I will say a bit too about his approach to the land market and also to infrastructure. I know those were things that you asked about. So I'll start now by saying a bit about London's governance structure. So we have the national government, Her Majesty's government, which sits there at the top of this diagram, and that government enacts legislation, devises regulations and distributes funding to the Mayor and to the 33 local authorities that make up London, and also to other equivalent local government structures throughout the rest of the UK. As Professor Lees mentioned, the Mayor's position is unique in the UK, and the Mayor's position between government and the 33 local authorities. And the Mayor's role is one of setting strategic policy direction in a number of areas. And in some areas of policy, including in housing, the Mayor distributes funding. And I know Professor Lees mentioned that the Mayor's powers are pretty limited in an international context. That's definitely the case. And one of the kind of key factors there is that tax raising powers in the UK are very heavily centralised. So the the mayor and London boroughs between them raise only about 30% of London's public funding, and they do that through council tax, which is charged on homes, and through a community infrastructure levy, which is charged on developers. So relative, as Professor Lee said, to lots of international mayors of cities comparable to London, the mayor has quite a tough time getting stuff done. And the work of the mayor is scrutinised by the London Assembly. So the Assembly has directly elected members, and they don't have any kind of executive or legislative powers, but they can overturn a mayoral strategy or a mayoral budget if 2/3 of Assembly members vote to do that. So they have a scrutiny function essentially. And just in terms of the language, often the mayor and the London Assembly are referred to together as the Greater London Authority. So I'll try and be clear in my terminology, but it might be helpful for you to know that. So I'll just provide a bit more detail now and add in a few extra players in this picture to explain sort of who does what in relation to housing in London. And I'll also try and say a bit more about what we in the London context mean by the term affordable housing, just because that's quite central to what I'm saying today. So government, as I've mentioned, sets the legal and policy framework. And one of those frameworks is the national planning policy that it's developed. And that policy requires private developers, when they're developing homes, to provide some affordable housing through agreements that are known as Section 106 agreements. And the term Section 106 simply refers to the bit of the particular law that provides a basis for planning authorities to ask them to provide affordable housing when they're developing homes. Government is also responsible for determining what funding the mayor and other parts of local government receive, and that can be broken down into both capital funding, which would typically be, or might, for example, be to develop new homes, or revenue funding, and that might be for a whole host of things, for example, welfare benefits to help lower income households cover the cost of their rent, or services for households who are facing homelessness, or services to help enforce standards in privately rented properties, so essentially to ensure that landlords are meeting their obligations. The mayor has one of his statutory responsibilities is, as Professor Lee mentioned, to produce the London Plan, which sets out a spatial development strategy for London. He also has a housing strategy, and there's close kind of overlap between the London Plan and the housing strategy. And local authorities, so borough strategies, are by law required to be broadly in line with the mayor's strategies. The mayor too has the final say over larger housing developments, so anything with more than 150 units. And he is also responsible for a couple of development corporations which hold planning powers in two areas where there's been particularly intense development, or is set to be particularly intense development in London. And that includes in the area where the Olympics were held back in 2012. The mayor negotiates with government for capital funding for developing affordable housing in London, and he administers that funding in London, so he has responsibility for that sort of subset of a national investment programme. The mayor also has some revenue funding, and one way he uses that, it's a fairly limited amount, but he uses that, for example, for services for those who are sleeping on the streets in London, so a fairly small but kind of complex population. The mayor also directs policy research and lobbying government, and that includes lobbying government as to how much funding he thinks London needs to develop the affordable housing that Londoners need. The mayor is responsible too, and I think Professor Lees mentioned this, for some functional bodies which cover really huge and complex areas like transport, policing and firefighting. And those bodies own some land, and some of that gets developed for residential purposes. So Transport for London, which oversees the city's bus and tube network and some of the train network, aims to deliver 20,000 homes on its land over the next 10 years. There are, as I mentioned, 33 local authorities, and each of those have their own planning frameworks and housing strategies that are consistent with the mayor's. And they make planning decisions locally in line with their own planning policies, apart from on those larger schemes that get referred, as I mentioned, to the mayor. Local authorities are also responsible for allocating social housing. I'll just take a bit of a digression at this point to talk about social housing, which is one part of what I mean when I talk about affordable housing. Social housing is the kind of longest standing form of affordable housing in the UK. It's rented housing at typically about, with rents in London, about half of market levels. And its allocation is quite strictly governed. So although local authorities allocate that housing, they have to do that by policies that are developed in line with a legal framework that applies nationally. And those homes go to those in particular forms of housing needs. And in many cases, local authorities are also landlords of social housing too. And currently they manage about 400,000 homes in London. So that's just over 1/10 of the homes in the city. So they're significant landlords in the city. And local authorities are also responsible for assisting households in London who are facing or experiencing homelessness. They administer some of the welfare benefits that are available to help households with housing costs. And they're responsible too for ensuring that private sector landlords are basically doing what they're required to do by law in terms of property and management standards. So then to come on to housing associations and developers, housing associations are a key player in the development of new housing and the management of affordable housing in London. They're non-profit organisations, and they manage social housing, but also the largest share of what I would talk about as intermediate housing. So it's a term we use in London to make up the other sort of part of affordable housing. So social housing plus intermediate housing fall under the banner of affordable housing. And intermediate housing is a more sort of recent thing than social housing. It's cheaper than housing on the open market by at least 20%. So it's not as heavily discounted as social housing. And although there are some sort of policies in place to ensure that it does go to those in need, its allocation isn't governed in the same kind of strict way as social housing is. And it's also often focused on supporting people into home ownership, which I know is something that's of interest to you. And most often that's done through what we would refer to as shared ownership. Homes where buyers who couldn't afford to buy on the open market can buy a share of the home and then pay discounted rent on the remaining share, which, if their financial position changes, they are entitled to buy at some point in the future. So hopefully that gives you a clearer picture of what I mean when I talk about affordable housing. And just in terms of housing associations and their scale, the 12 largest housing associations in London own or manage more than 600,000 homes, so about 17% of all homes in London. And they also build a quarter of London's new homes. So they are kind of key to this picture. And then we also have private developers, many of them large organisations which focus on building homes for sale. And as I've mentioned as well, planning policy, as it's set at a national level and then mediated through the mayor and local borough policies, they can be required to make some of the homes that they're developing for affordable housing. and often housing associations will take on and manage some of those homes. So that's a bit of background on how London kind of works and the different players, and I'll talk a bit now about housing in London and some of the pressures that the city faces. So what this graph shows is how there has in many ways been a boom in London over the last 25 years. So there's been a sharp increase in jobs, it's the blue line, and quite a marked increase in population, that's the yellow line. But the city's housing stock, the red line, staggering along at the bottom of the graph, hasn't kept up with that development. And so kind of it's no surprise that in the context of those things happening, house prices have risen hugely. So they're higher in London, much higher in London than in the rest of England. And if you adjust for inflation, they still cost 6 times more now than they did in 1970. And you can see on the graphs on this screen that that rise in prices has resulted in a fall in home ownership among all but older households in London. And we're in a situation now where 53% of parents of a child or children aged 20 to 34 who live in London have at least one child living with them. And that's a much higher proportion than in any other region of England. And the government has introduced some initiatives to try and help typically younger people to buy homes for the first time. But what we find is that those initiatives are less kind of relevant in London because of the high house prices, and in particular the large sort of sums that first-time buyers need to stump up by way of a deposit. So just to give you a couple of examples of schemes that the government has developed, because I know this whole issue of supporting first-time buyers is of interest to you. They have developed the Help to Buy scheme, which is actually coming to an end this autumn. But what that has done is to provide equity loans, which are initially for a period of 5 years interest-free for first-time buyers. And that scheme does make provision for those buying home in London to borrow a larger share of the property value than first-time buyers are able to in other areas of the country. But it's still only really those with quite high incomes who are able to benefit from that scheme in London. Another much more recent government scheme is known as First Homes. And the idea there is that when developers develop homes for sale, they can meet the obligations that they have under planning policy to provide affordable housing by providing some of those homes for sale at a discount if the local planning authority is supportive of them doing that. And again, that policy allows for heavier discounts in London than in other areas of the country. But nonetheless, I think the Mayor is unconvinced that even quite heavily discounted homes in London are likely to be affordable to many of those in need. And many of those people in need are earning above average incomes, but still struggling to secure suitable housing. What we've seen too is that as rates of home ownership have gone down, more and more people are renting privately, and the costs of that have increased. So by 43% since 2005, so a really huge increase, and certainly starker than any other area of London. Sorry, I think I got a bit overexcited and moved on by 2 slides there. We see not only just sort of more households overall living in the private rented sector, but also more households in particular with children. And this kind of growth in the private rented sector and growth in families living in the private rented sector is because of that rise in house prices, but also because the scale of the social rented sector has decreased, as you can see on this graph. And that's because of a combination of factors, so lack of new supply, slower turnover of tenants in existing social housing, and also the sale of homes from social rented stock through the government's right to buy policy introduced back in the 1980s. And that policy enables social tenants to buy their homes from local authorities at a significant discount. And renting privately in London is expensive, as I've mentioned. And in fact, many of those at one point last year, about 40%, we estimate, of those who are renting privately in London need welfare benefits to help them cover their rent. So it's expensive to the public purse as well as to the individual tenant. But private renting is also much less secure than social housing. Landlords there can give tenants 2 months' notice at the moment with no particular grounds, although the government did commit 3 years ago to improving private tenants' security of tenure. And private tenants are less satisfied with their tenure than social renters or homeowners. And kind of in terms of what all this means, it has some very serious negative impacts for London and Londoners. So businesses and public services have real difficulties recruiting and retaining staff. There are more children living in poverty when housing costs are taken into account in London than in other areas of the UK. And rates of poverty are highest among those who rent their homes. There are about 60,000 households in London who are homeless and are in accommodation that's provided by boroughs. And quite often that accommodation is away from the borough where they've become homeless. So there's a whole sort of pattern of disruption and displacement there. There are higher numbers of people in London who are sofa surfing, so sort of staying quite precariously in the homes of friends or family, or living as a household within another household's home, so often an adult child and a partner, and perhaps their children living with their parents. And that contributes to rates of overcrowding that are much higher in London than elsewhere in England. And it creates a housing market where, particularly in the private rented sector, almost 1 in 5 homes don't meet the decent home standard. So that's a government standard for the quality of a home, and that covers basically the health and safety of the home. And all of these things have a disproportionate impact on some Londoners, particularly those from Black and ethnic minority groups, and on single parents as well. So those things kind of compound existing inequalities in the city, and they have adverse impacts on both physical and mental health. And we saw during the pandemic that transmission of COVID was worse among some of those living in poorest housing. So a real reminder of the kind of human cost of London's housing crisis. So the crisis is big, and the kind of challenges to the borders to tackling it are also significant. So the supply of land in London is constrained. There are lots of conservation areas in London where planning policy means that you can't develop. And a lot of the major regeneration opportunities, so things like King's Cross, have already been taken. Land prices are high, and increasingly the value of London's industrial land is close to that of land for residential use. Large developers who are developing homes for sale dominate the housing market, and kind of increasingly more so after each economic downturn. And the rate at which they build out homes tends to be slow. They have a sort of vested interest in not flooding the market with homes for sale in particular areas. We're also seeing a real shortage of those with construction skills, and that has been compounded by Brexit, because many of that workforce came from Europe. And Brexit too, along with the pandemic and now war in Ukraine, is contributing to a lot of pressure on supply chains, and really steep inflation, and particularly the cost of construction materials has risen a great deal. Infrastructure, something that Professor Lees mentioned, is often a big challenge, and one where it's hard to kind of align the provision of infrastructure in the areas where housing development is going ahead, and to get that all to line up in a timely way. There are also really important considerations around reducing carbon emissions. The Mayor has set a target for London to be net zero by 2030, and around ensuring the fire safety of existing and new buildings. And that was something that's really underlined by the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower 5 years ago, actually just this week. And I think because developers and particularly providers of affordable housing are aware that they need to invest in the energy efficiency and the fire safety of existing homes, that means that they have less capacity to develop new homes. So lots of challenges. I'll come on now to say a bit about the Mayor's approach and some of the things that he's doing to try and tackle those challenges, to tackle the housing crisis. And I will focus in particular on the London Plan, some of his housing policies that align closely with the London Plan, and also his programme of investment in affordable housing. So the London Plan, it's a weighty old document developed over years in line with the legal requirements which exist here around developing planning policy. So consultation on the Mayor's new London Plan started soon after he was elected in 2016, and it was adopted early last year. The London Plan also takes a kind of long-term perspective, so it plans up until 2041, although there are some sort of shorter-term targets within the document. And the document is informed too by a whole range of robust evidence. So I know some of you are interested in these things in particular, so I put links in the slides. There is a strategic housing market assessment which uses demographic and housing data to estimate the number of new homes that will be needed in London to meet existing and future needs by tenure and by type. So that's including how many of those homes should be affordable, as well as looking at what homes are needed by some particular groups. So for example, older people. There is also a strategic housing land availability assessment that's undertaken with boroughs to identify where in London there is capacity to develop new homes. And there are a whole series too of infrastructure assessments. So these assessments look at things like heat network priority areas, wastewater drainage capacity, and broadband coverage. And the London Plan that was adopted last year has as its kind of unique selling point and its identifying theme what the Mayor describes as good growth. And this slide lists the kind of objectives that form part of good growth. And I guess the idea there is for growth to be inclusive and about the needs of all those who live in the city. And I think that kind of focus came about in 2016 when the Mayor was elected at what I think his advisors have talked about as a bit of a crossroads. So this sense that London in many ways had done very well, and I show that slide showing growth in the jobs in London, but that not all Londoners had benefited from that in all sorts of ways. And in fact, some of them were also disadvantaged by growth. And I guess the lack of housing supply was one of the things that were disadvantaging many Londoners, and particularly those on lower incomes. So good growth is kind of a key theme. Now this map, which I appreciate you probably can't see all that clearly, and which you might want to look at in the London Plan online to have a clearer view, reflects the spatial vision of London that's at the heart of the London Plan. And I will kind of just pinpoint a few key features of it. So I'll try and talk you through it, so don't worry too much if you can't see it. So this spatial vision of London protects green belts, so green land around the edges of the city to stop urban sprawl, and also other green open spaces within the city. It identifies a central activities zone, which has multiple sort of commercial, cultural and political roles, and also an array of town centres. And those existing town centres across London, it identifies as offering good opportunities for housing development because they're close to existing amenities and to existing transport networks. And then critically, again, as Professor Lees mentions, it identifies opportunity areas where the Mayor and boroughs identify that there is significant potential to deliver new jobs and new homes. And those areas are the subjects of opportunity area planning frameworks, which are prepared by the GLA planning and infrastructure teams, working closely with utilities companies. And the opportunity areas are often clustered into growth corridors, so looking at the need for transport between those areas and overlapping with the Mayor's transport strategy. And I'll talk a bit more shortly about the coordinating role that the Mayor plays in relation to opportunity areas. I wanted to just give you a bit of a sense of a couple of opportunity areas. One that I was going to show to you will in fact be familiar to you because Professor Lees spoke about it. So King's Cross, there is a before photo and an after photo. But I won't say a huge amount more because we have heard about that already. Another area is around Stratford in East London, where the Olympics was held back in 2012. And you can see there the development of that area over the years. So an Olympic park and housing that was used for athletes in 2012. But now, yeah, you can see the housing at the bottom of the screen. And I was also going to mention that in King's Cross, there was careful attention to the kind of heritage and industrial features of the development. So infrastructure, I've mentioned, is important, and the London plan is strong on it. It has requirements for boroughs to plan for needs for infrastructure, so things like health facilities, childcare, schools, open spaces, and also to have policies in place to ensure that developments don't contribute, for example, to deterioration in air quality. I'll talk a bit too about the specific housing policies in the London plan. So the plan contains overall borough level targets for the number of new homes needed for the next 10 years. And boroughs are expected to include those plans to meet those targets in their own local plans. There are specific borough level targets too for new homes on small sites. And that policy is a new one. It's partly about densifying housing, but it's also about diversifying the type and tenure of housing. So on a small site, you are likely to get, say, smaller builders rather than just the big house builders developing. That policy did get some criticism. So there were claims, for example, that the Mayor was staging a garden grab in the suburbs of outer London. But there are elements in that policy that are intended to ensure that that doesn't happen. So, for example, the policy requires that there is no net loss of green space, and that might mean using green roofs or green walls. And boroughs are also expected to work with local communities to develop design codes for development on small sites. And the Mayor has then in his London plan a suite of policies on affordable housing. So there's an ambitious strategic target for 50% of new homes to be affordable. And that's a particularly kind of strict target for public land or former industrial land or for developments that have got mayoral funding. There's also what's called a threshold approach that provides a fast track through the planning process for developments where at least 35% of housing will be affordable. And the idea there is to kind of avoid the quite resource intensive site by site negotiation and scrutiny around the number of, or the proportion of affordable housing that developers would provide through Section 106 agreements. And it's meant to set a really clear expectation that developers must provide affordable housing, and to provide clarity for them and bolster investor confidence. The plan also says that 30% of affordable homes must be for social rent, 30% as intermediate housing, and it leaves it up to the local planning authority, to the borough, to determine what's appropriate for the rest. Other housing policies include a specific policy on build to rent. So that's a relatively new tenure in London, where investors are developing whole blocks for rent, often with services provided. And the recognition of that form of tenure is meant to give confidence to investors of that, and to ensure too that it provides some affordable housing. And I guess that's also part of helping diversification, because the kind of investors who are going for build to rent are different from the big house builders. There are specific policies on some different needs, so targets for specialist housing for older people at a borough level, and also an expectation for boroughs to meet the needs of gypsies and travellers. The plan is clear that all major developments should be net zero carbon, and there are also policies on the quality and standards of homes, and those include standards for the amount of space internally and for the accessibility of homes for those whose mobility is or might become limited. I'm just going to skip through a couple of slides there, but feel free to look at those later. So just coming back to that issue, the all-important issue of housing supply, there has been an increase in the number of homes completed, and also in the proportion of those that are affordable in the last few years. And we think that the key factors here are the combination of high demand, but also a planning system that has enabled there to be some high density development in locations where that has been sustainable. So for example, in King's Cross and in Stratford around the Olympic Park. We're also seeing an increase in the proportion of affordable housing. So this data here is on planning applications for larger sites that have been referred to the Mayor. You can see that the proportion of homes in those developments over the years that are affordable has gone up. The blue line is the 35% threshold that I mentioned, and for the last 3 years, more than 35% of housing for developments in those plans has been affordable. So that is good news. And I'll say a bit now about the Mayor's, another of the Mayor's key tools for tackling London's housing crisis. So programmes that he runs as a subset, I mentioned, of the National Plan for Investment in Affordable Housing. It's funded by national government, so there is some kind of negotiation and compromise around the amount of funding and the terms on which the Mayor is able to provide that funding. So, for example, in the most recent round of funding, there is very limited funding for replacing affordable homes that are demolished, and that can be a problem when it comes to funding estate regeneration projects, which are an important source of new homes. But the Mayor did negotiate with government that funding could be allocated to replace homes that had become obsolete, so needed to be demolished because they were unsafe, for example. Also, the government is clear that where the Mayor, through this programme, is funding intermediate homes, those need to provide a rent to home ownership, a route to home ownership. That can be tricky in London because of the high cost of housing. It's difficult, even with subsidies, for people to afford those. So what the Mayor did was negotiate with London, with government, a new London-specific tenure, London Living Rent, which gives residents up to 10 years renting at discounted rates, where they can save for a deposit to buy potentially that home, potentially another home on a shared ownership basis. Through this programme, the Mayor funds mostly housing associations, but also and increasingly local authorities. there was a long period in which it was very difficult for a whole host of reasons for local authorities to develop housing, but that is changing, and we're now in the position where the Mayor is funding all 33 London boroughs to develop affordable homes. And he's run a couple of kind of kickstart programs, a capital program and a revenue funding program to help them build their capacity to do that. So this funding is really valuable, but the current program, which runs over 5 years, is a £4 billion program. That amounts to 35% of the national funding pot, and the Mayor doesn't consider that proportionate to London's need, and also thinks this is a fairly small share of what's actually needed. So the Mayor and London's major housing associations calculated that London actually needs about 4.9 billion a year, not over 5 years, to deliver the affordable homes that London needs. The Mayor also set some funding conditions in his policy that sort of reinforce London plan requirements and provide a means of helping to tackle some of those kind of systemic factors that I mentioned earlier on. And one thing in particular it's worth highlighting, I think, is his resident ballot requirement. So when he's providing funding for larger estate regeneration projects where there is going to be demolition, he will only provide that funding if the housing association or local authority seeking it can demonstrate that they've consulted with residents and that residents have voted in favour of plans. And the idea there is to give estate residents some leverage in saying what happens to their estate and ensuring that we avoid the kind of displacement that Professor Lees was speaking about and which the Haygate Estate illustrates. This graph shows the number of homes supported with funding from the Mayor, and there's been an increase over recent years, with the exception of 2021, when COVID caused a lot of delays in construction. And that number of homes developed has consistently been in excess of the targets that government sets for the Mayor, along with that funding. So just two more things to cover briefly, a bit about the Mayor's approach to land and a bit about the Mayor's supporting role with infrastructure. So on land, the Mayor established back in 2017 a land fund. And the idea of that is that it would provide a pot of money to intervene in the land market, to buy sites or to assist with remediation or infrastructure provision, where that would either unlock sites that weren't getting developed, or where that would increase the number of homes developed, or particularly the proportion of affordable housing. And the government kind of supported him in that by adding to that fund the following year. And often the funding that's provided through the fund is provided on a basis where it can be recycled back into the fund. So for example, as a loan. Now, there's a limit, obviously, to the number of instances in which the Mayor can intervene. But I think the part of the idea is to provide a sort of model of how public bodies can function with regard to land. So there are a couple of sites that have been purchased with funding from the land fund. So the first was St Anne's Hospital. It's a large 19th century hospital site in North London, where health services were sort of redeveloping wards that were no longer fit for purpose. They were sort of spread across quite a large site. There were some plans for housing also on that site, but not very many homes and only a small percentage of them affordable. So the Mayor bought that site and is now leading development there, and that has brought about a big increase in the number of homes that are going to be developed, and an increase from 14 to 60% in the proportion that will be affordable. In the pictures you can see a water tower that's one of the old features on that site, and then some plans for housing redeveloped around that. And then the second example I wanted to give is also in North London, the site of the former Holloway prison, which closed down a few years ago. It's a large site, and the mayor lent Peabody Housing Association £42 million to buy that site on the condition that it would deliver 1,000 homes, of which 60% would be affordable. And then just to talk about infrastructure a bit as well, I mentioned policies in the London plan, but also the mayor's supporting role. The mayor developed something called the London Infrastructure Plan 2050, and that sets out the city's infrastructure agenda with information on growth, needs, costs, and that is used for planning, but also for lobbying government providers on infrastructure issues. He also has an infrastructure team, and that team supports boroughs and developers. So, for example, it works with utility providers on connections for new developments. And there's an example on this slide of an area in East London, the Isle of Dogs and South Popular Opportunity Area Planning Framework. We work closely with the local authority in that area, Tower Hamlets Council, on a whole range of plans to enable development in that opportunity area. And the mayor's infrastructure team also looks at new approaches to better understand the implications of growth. So it's developed, for example, a growth and capacity planner tool, and that combines growth data from boroughs along with utility companies' data on capacity. I've added just a couple of slides that I'll leave you to look at in your own time on transport and culture, because I know those are things you are interested in. But I've come to the end of my time, and thank you very much for listening, and it has been good to be with you today.
저는 런던정경대 지리환경학과에서 재직하고 있는 신영광 교수라고 하고요. 오늘 시도지사협의회 온라인 웨비나에서 토론을 맡게 되었습니다. 남은 시간이 한 13분 정도 되는 것 같은데요. 이 시간 동안 한 3가지 정도 주제에 맞추어서 집중해서 토론을 하도록 할게요. 오늘 로레타 리스 교수하고 데보라 헬링 님께서 발표하신 도시재생과 어포더블 하우징 주제는 우리나라에도 많은 시사점을 줄 것이라 생각합니다. 도시재생 같은 경우에는 로레타 리스 교수가 얘기했던 대로 영국에서는 여러 개념을 포괄하는 상위 개념이라고 할 수 있고요. 오늘 주제 발표하시는 과정에서 50년대에서 70년대까지는 Urban Renewal이라고 하는 것으로 알려졌었고, 80년대에는 우리말로 직역하자 하면은 도시 재개발, 개발, 그리고 좀 더 이제 90년대 이후에는 도시 부흥, Urban Renaissance, 도시 부흥이라고 번역할 수 있는 그런 개념으로 알려져 있었는데, 어쨌든 이런 모든 것을 포괄하는 개념을 상위 개념으로 도시 재생이라고 이제 저희가 번역을 할 수 있지만, 또 한국에서는 이제 그 도시 재생이라고 하는 것이 좀 더 최근 한 7, 8년 사이에 도입되어 적용되었던 특정 구체적인 또 도시 정책으로 또 존재하기 때문에 여기서 약간의 이제 개념이 혼란스러울 수 있을 것 같긴 해요. 어포더블 하우징 같은 경우에도 오늘 데보라 씨께서 주제 발표해 주셨는데, 어포더블 하우징 같은 경우에는 약간의 이제 한국에서도 조금 이것이 무엇인가라고 질문을 하실 수 있을 것 같아요. 근데 기본적으로 어포더블 하우징에는 자가도 포함되어 있고 임대도 포함되어 있고요. 영국에서 말하는 어포더블 하우징에는 이제 소셜 렌티드 하우징이라 해서 우리말로 번역하자면 사회주택이라고 사회 임대주택이라고 직역할 수 있긴 하지만 공공 임대주택이라고 하는 것이 좀 더 맞지 않을까 생각이 들긴 하고요. 그리고 또 이제 부담 가능한 적정 수준의 임대료가 적용된 주택이라고 좀 풀어서 번역할 수 있는 affordable rent housing이 또 있고, 또 이제 affordable home ownership도 포함되어 있긴 한데, 보통 이제 공공 임대주택이라 할 때는 어떤 지역 시장 임대료의 한 50% 수준에서 제공되는 지자체 임대주택을 이제 지칭을 하고요. 또 affordable rented housing이라 할 때는 시장 임대주택의 한 80% 정도에 해당하는 임대료가 적용된 이제 그 임대주택을 지칭합니다. 아무래도 이제 기준점이 시장 임대료이다 보니까 시장 임대료 자체가, 그리고 시장 주택 가격이 상승하는 지역에서는 이 렌트 역시 어포더블 렌트 역시 상승을 하게 될 것은 자명하고요. 아무래도 런던처럼 이제 그 주택 임대료나 주택 가격이 많이 상승한 곳은 이 임대료 역시 적정 임대료라고 얘기하는 것조차 이제 많이 상승하게 되고, 그 상승폭이 아무래도 부동산 가격이 일반 어떤 소득의 상승폭보다 훨씬 더 빠른 속도로 증가하기 때문에 적정 임대료라 하더라도 이것이 어느 정도까지 그 소득 수준에 실제 소득에 맞춘 적정 임대료일까라고 하는 것은 항상 의문점으로 남는 것 같습니다. 도시재생 같은 경우에는 취약계층의 삶의 질을 개선하기 위해서 도입되었다라고 로레타 리스 교수가 이제 강조했었고요. 또 이 점 역시 이제 저희가 다시 한번 되새겨볼 점이긴 한데, 아무래도 도시재생 과정에서 목표 자체가 취약계층의 삶의 질 개선이라고 하긴 하지만 실제 적용 과정에서는 특정 지역의 낙인 찍기 등도 이제 종종 동반되었고, 그 과정에서 물리적 공간의 개선 사업에 집중하는 모습을 보였던 것이 사실인 것 같습니다. 그래서 이제 어떻게 보면 사회적 어떤 그 삶의 질의 개선에 초점을 역시 맞추어야 함에도 불구하고 물리적인 환경 개선에 더 집중된 것이 아니냐라고 하는 어떤 비판이 많이 제기되어지는 것이 이제 영국에서의 도시 재생의 모습이기도 하고, 이것이 영국뿐만 아니라 많은 나라에서 우리나라 포함한 많은 나라에서 나타나는 모습인 것 같습니다. 이런 도시 재생을 통해서 새롭게 제공되는 서비스나 이제 주택이 워낙 비싸기에 그 기존 거주민의 구매력과는 격차가 크기 때문에 아무래도 도시 재생 자체가 외지인, 그래서 구매력이 더 높은 외지인의 이용과 거주, 소유 중심으로 진행되는 것이 역시 많이 나타나는 문제점이 아니냐라고 생각이 들고요. 그 두 분의 주제 발표자께서 공유한 그 다양한 이제 사례, 어떤 관점에서 보면은 성공 사례라고 할 수 있고, 또 다른 관점에서 보면은 그다지 성공하지 않은 또는 실패한 사례라고도 볼 수 있는 것이, 아무래도 그 누구를 위한 개발이냐, 그리고 누가 더 소외되었느냐라고 하는 그런 질문에 있어서 어떤 답을 구하느냐에 따라서 그 개발 프로젝트의 평가 역시 엇갈리는 것 같습니다. 아무래도 구매력이 더 높은 외지인을 유인할 수 있는 정책과 사업을 추진하려고 하는 것이 많은 지자체가 갖고 있는 관심 중에 하나인 것은 어쩔 수 없는 현실인 것 같아요. 이를 통해서 어떤 지역의 일자리도 창출하고, 또 지역에서 거둘 수 있는 어떤 소득 세금도 좀 더 높일 수 있어서 지역에서 사업할 수 있는 어떤 물적 기반을 확보할 수 있는 것도 사실 많은 지자체장들의 관심사이긴 한 것은 너무 당연할 수 있다고 얘기할 수 있긴 하지만, 아무래도 구매력이 더 높은 외지인을 유인하려고 하는 과정에서 이제 기존 어떤 그 지역 정책의 기반이라고 할 수 있는 지역 주민의 소외가 어느 정도 소외가 일어나는 것을 어느 정도 방지할 수 있느냐라고 하는 것은 큰 중요한 문제라고 생각됩니다. 근데 구매력이 더 높은 외지인을 유인할 수 있는 방식의 어떤 지역 도시 재생을 한다 하더라도, 그 주택 개발을 한다 하더라도 사실 이런 어떤 외지인을 유인할 수 있고 또 외부 자본을 유입할 수 있는 그런 지역은 사실은 극히 제한되어 있다라고 하는 것이 또 하나의 어떤 그 고민 지점인 것 같아요. 그래서 이 경우에서 런던 같은 경우에는 주제 발표자께서도 다 지적하셨지만, 아무래도 영국의 수도이기도 하고, 또 영국의 수도뿐만 아니라 전 세계 금융 자본의 중심 도시이기도 하고, 그래서 어떤 세계 도시로서의 런던의 위상이라는 것은 런던 내에서도 어느 타 지역 도시가 따라올 수 없는 그런 이제 위상을 런던이 가졌기 때문에, 런던은 어떻게 보면은 아무리 영국 경제가 좀 더 침체되어 있다 하더라도 세계 자본이 집중할 수 있는 그런 조건을 갖추고 있어서 런던이 생각하는 도시 재생과 어떤 도시 공간 구조의 개편은 영국 내 다른 지역 도시가 고민하는 것과는 좀 다를 수 있다라는 것을 좀 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 이러다 보니까 한국에서의 시사점을 생각해 볼 때 런던이 영국에서 볼 때는 아무래도 좀 더 독특한 위치를 차지하는, 그래서 뭐 어떻게 보면 일부는 또 런던 공화국이다라고까지 얘기하는 그런 위상을 갖고 있기 때문에 우리가 도시재생과 주택정책을 얘기할 때 런던의 사례를 놓고 본다면은 다소 약간은 편향된 시각으로 영국의 주택정책을 보게 되는 것이 아닌가 생각을 할 수 있을 것 같고요. 그래서 런던을 중심으로 본 도시재생 및 주택정책을 영국의 사례로 이해한다면은 조금은 제한된 이해를 하게 되지 않을까 염려스러운 마음이 듭니다. 이것은 한국에 빗대어서 본다 하더라도 한국에 적용해서 생각해 본다면은 여러 지역 도시 지역 발전 정책이 수도권을 중심으로 이루어진 것, 또 수도권의 관점에서 아니면 서울의 관점에서 지역을 바라보는 어떤 그런 정책의 입안과 제안이 갖고 있는 문제점을 많은 분들이 이제 지적해 왔지만 이런 문제점, 그래서 수도권 중심의 그리고 서울의 관점에서 어떤 주택 정책과 주택 정책의 생산과 소비가 이루어지는 것은 지극히 조심해야 되지 않을까라고 생각이 들고요. 특히 오늘과 같은 시도지사 협의회 공간에서는 서울과는 전혀 다른 위상을 가지고 있고 현실이 전혀 다른 지역 도시 시군 도시가 갖고 있는 어떤 그 지역의 어떤 고민이 충분히 반영된, 그래서 지역을 통해서 뭐 다른 지역이나 서울을 바라보는 그런 관점에서의 어떤 정책의 입안과 생산이 필요하지 않을까, 그리고 그런 관점에서 지역 간 협의가 이루어져야 되지 않을까 생각이 들고요. 마지막으로 하고 싶은 것은 로레타 리스 교수도 얘기했지만 포용도시의 중요성입니다. 그래서 아무래도 이 포용도시의 중요성은 한국 같은 경우는 특히나 더 중요할 것 같은데, 왜냐하면 그 한국에서의 어떤 부의 집중이 일부 소수에게 부의 집중이 이루어진, 특히 부동산을 통한 부의 집중이 소수에게 이루어져서 빈부격차가 지극히 아주 큰 한국 같은 곳에서는 이 빈부격차가 사회적 불안을 이야기한다는 측면에서 조금 더 격차를 줄일 수 있는, 그래서 가장 취약한 계층이 도시 재생이나 지역 발전을 통해서 혜택을 받을 수 있는 방향으로, 그런 관점에서 처음부터 도시 재생과 주택 공급 정책이 마련되어야 되지 않을까. 그래서 포용이라는 관점이 지역 정책 입안할 때 처음부터 고려되어야 할 요소가 아닐까 생각이 들고요. 이 포용 정책, 포용 도시를 이루기 위한 그 수단으로서, 뭐 수단이라기보다는 이루기 위해서는 한 3가지 정도 간략히 중요하다고 이제 간략히 이제 말씀드리고 맺으려고 합니다. 첫 번째는 지역 공동체 역량 강화가 제일 중요하고요. 그래서 지역 주민들이 처음부터 참여하는 과정에서 정책의 입안과 생산, 소비 과정에서 참여하고 실시되는 과정에서도 적극 주체적으로 나서야 되는 측면 되게 중요한 것 같습니다. 도시재생 정책에서 지역 주민이 중심이 되어지는 도시재생이 이루어져야 한다라는 것과 이제 일맥상통하는데요. 그런데 이 관점에서, 이런 점에서 두 번째로 또 이제 얘기 드릴 수 있는 것이, 보통 우리가 지역 주민이라고 할 때 일반적으로 지역 주민은 결국 토지 건물 소유주가 소유주로 등치되어지는 것을 많이 볼 수 있습니다. 이런 것은 이제 도시 재생에서도 많이 보여지는 그런 모습이었다라고 이제 생각되어지고요. 그러다 보니까 주민이라고 이제 계속 강조되어지긴 하지만 실제 적용되어지는 과정에서는 주민이 토지 건물 소유주가 되다 보니까 경제적 재생, 그래서 물질적인 부의 증가나 물리적 환경의 개선 위주로 정책이 입안되고 실시되어지는 도시 재생이 이루어지는 어떤 문제점이 있다 보니까, 이제 세 번째 마지막으로 제가 말씀드릴 수 있는 것이 social sustainability라고 얘기할 수 있는 사회적 지속 가능성 을 좀 더 고민해야 되지 않을까 생각이 듭니다. 이 점 역시 로레타 리스 교수가 강조했던 것이었고요. 이런 사회적 지속 가능성에서 가장 취약한 계층이 소외되지 않을 수 있는, 그래서 거기서부터 시작할 수 있는 어떤 그 정책의 입안 수립이 중요하다라고 말씀드리는 것으로서 오늘 토론을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.